We are looking at must start and sit running backs for week 8 of the fantasy football season. We're looking at all 32 teams, all 16 matchups. At the end of this video, I will have discussed 60 plus running backs. So consider this your complete guide to the running back position in week 8 of the fantasy football season. The first matchup that we are going to look at today is the Thursday night game. That is the Bucks at the Bills. 41.5 point over under, and the Bills are favored, obviously, at home. As for the Bucks side of the ball, Rachaad White, we're going to consider him a spot start. Now, there's some clarity that I need to provide here. In a 12-man league, I would consider him a must start. So it just depends on what sort of format you're in. But Rachaad White has been really the definition of boom bust this entire year. In 3 bad games, he's averaged 7 points per game. And then in his 3 good games, he's averaging 16 PPR points per game. The good news for Rachaad White is no one is relatively close to competing for his touches. He's averaging 17.7 opportunities per game. His usage, his snap percentage is the 5th best amongst running backs in the NFL. His routes run per team dropback is the 2nd highest number amongst running backs in the NFL. And he has the 23rd most targets. He has the 13th most targets, rather, despite missing 1 game compared to the rest of the guys with a bye week. With how many injuries we've had this year in any 12-man league, like I said, Rachaad White should be in your starting lineup. Also, it doesn't, it's weird because it hasn't been for the last couple of years, but this year the Buffalo Bills are actually a very good matchup for your fantasy running back. So I would say start him if you're in a 12-man and you have no better options. As for the Bills side of the ball, James Cook is a must start for me in 5 of 7 matchups. He's been a good starting running back through 7 games. He's the RB14, averaging 12.8 PPR points per game and 15.5 touches total opportunities per game. In this offense, James Cook is turning into one of those key pieces for them. Consider him a must start in any 12-man format. You can't start Latavius Murray. He's only averaging about 5 points per game outside of that 1 game where he had over 10. And you can't start Keyshawn Vaughn. There's just not a scenario in which in this matchup you are starting anyone except for Rachaad White or James Cook. All right, let's go to the second matchup. Texans at Panthers. This is the beginning of the 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time slate. The over-under is 42.5, and the Texans are favored. Remember, this is the battle of the rookie quarterbacks, Bryce Young versus C.J. Stroud. It's going to be a fun one to watch. As for the Texans, this is a good matchup for their running backs, but this is a very difficult backfield to navigate right now. I would say that 90% of people have a better starting option on their roster than Dameon Pierce or Devin Singletary this week. It is too difficult to decipher this backfield as we currently stand. Dameon Pierce, I have listed as a risky start. Maybe you could call him a desperation play at this moment. Last time this team played in week 6 versus the Saints, Devin Singletary led this backfield. Devin Singletary had more snaps, 54 to 33% in favor of him over Dameon Pierce. He had more routes run, more targets, more total touches, and more yards. The only reason I would even consider Dameon in my lineup this week is because of the matchup. The Panthers give up the 2nd most points to the running back position, and they actually allow the 2nd most rushing yards per game in the NFL. They give up 144 yards on the ground on a per game basis. Still, like I said, 90% of people have a better option than Dameon and Devin. There's just too many unknowns in this matchup. There's a chance Devin Singletary takes over this backfield again, and then you're starting Dameon Pierce. There's also a chance that Dameon Pierce ends up having a good day on the ground against a weak rush defense. As for the Panthers side of the ball, the Texans are no longer a smash matchup for running backs. They're middle of the pack. They're a respectable run defense at this point of the Texans era. And we have a little bit of a similar situation as the Texans backfield in Carolina. Frank Wright has already come out and said publicly that this will be a committee backfield between Sanders and Hubbard. So both of these guys are going to split work in a poor offense. Again, similar as the previous guys, I think 90% of people have a better starting option than these two. And while Hubbard was a great play last time out, there was no Miles Sanders, and Miles Sanders was injured. All right, the third matchup we're going to talk about is the Rams at the Cowboys, a 45.5-point over-under with the Cowboys favored. This is one of 4 matchups tied for the second highest over-under this week. As for the Rams side of the ball, Darrell Henderson is your spot start. Not a must start, a spot start if you're in a tough position. Right, last week, Henderson played the most on third downs, the most on early downs. He was the only back out there on the 2-minute drill. He had the most fantasy points. He scored the touchdown, 20 total opportunities. However, he faces the Dallas Cowboys, which is not a good matchup. They give up the third fewest points to fantasy running backs through 7 weeks. So I could easily see Darrell Henderson getting under 10 points in a tough matchup. Unless the volume is just ridiculous, I would not look at starting Darrell or Royce Freeman. Now, there are some people out there who, hey, that is my best starting option. Okay, put him out there. Hopefully he gets a goal line touchdown, but lower your expectations because without that touchdown, I don't envision a very good day. As for the Cowboys side of the ball, we don't really need to waste too much time. You start Tony Pollard, RB11 in points per game, averaging over PPR points per game. And he is dominating touches out of that backfield. Almost 21 total opportunities per game. He is top 12 amongst running backs in snap percentage, routes run per team dropback, team target share, and expected fantasy points per game. You start Tony Pollard with confidence, and you don't start anyone else from that backfield. All right, we are about to get into the fourth matchup. Just quickly, can you do me a huge favor and smash that like button for me? I'm going through every matchup, doing the absolute most to bring you the most research so you are prepared this week for your week 8 matchup. So do me a favor, hit that like button. But the fourth matchup we're going to look at today is the Vikings at the Packers. It is a divisional showdown. And after what we saw last week with Alexander Mattison and Cam Akers, it was very much a split backfield. I know this is a good matchup. The Packers give up the 3rd most points to fantasy running backs, but I can't currently decipher this backfield. I couldn't tell you if Alexander Mattison is going to lead the way or if it's Cam Akers. We also saw Ty Chandler out there on Monday Night Football. So it's my personal opinion that I don't think you should start a running back from the Vikings unless you're in a very, very deep league. As for the Packers side of the ball, there is nuance here. So if you're only forwarding the video and just looking at who start, who sit, you will miss the nuance here. Here's how we're going to approach this. As for Aaron Jones, I am labeling him a must start. You might be asking yourself, why are you labeling him a must start? Last week, Aaron Jones played just 36% of the snaps. I'm assuming he's going to be full go as we head into week 8. If we get a report that he is full go, you can put him into your lineups. You know, he had 13 touches on only 36% of the snaps. If he gets back up to that 50% mark, he will be someone that you will want in your starting lineup for most people. Now, of course, I have to mention that if Aaron Jones is limited throughout the week, then you now need to label him as a risky start. He's no longer a confident start unless he's full go in these practices, and we hear reports that he won't be limited. As for A.J. Dillon, regardless of if Aaron Jones is full go or not, he is a risky start for me. The Vikings are not an easy matchup for running backs this year. At the time of recording this video, they give up the 2nd fewest points to the position. So this is not really a matchup that we think as a smash matchup like we have been in the past with these Minnesota Vikings. All right, the 5th matchup we're looking at here is the Saints at the Colts. It's a 42.5-point over-under, and the Colts are favored at home. How about that? The Colts favored at home. You love to see it. As for the Saints, this is very easy. You start Alvin Kamara. Despite missing 3 games due to suspension, Alvin Kamara is on track to get 137 targets this year. That's ridiculous. That's like wide receiver 1/2 type of usage. Currently averaging 9.8 targets per game and 27 total opportunities per game. This is absolutely awful for the Saints offense, the way it's working in real life. It's a very limited offense. But for fantasy, it is beautiful. I cannot think of a scenario in which you do not start Alvin Kamara versus the Colts, especially when this defense gives up the 6th most points to running backs. As for the Colts side of the ball, Jonathan Taylor is moving into the must-start category. 3 weeks in a row, JT has increased his snap percentage, his rushing attempts, his total touches, and his fantasy points. I expect them to continually get him more and more snaps more and more opportunities. He will be the focal point of this offense from here on out. You don't pay a running back $42 million and not feature the guy. As for Zach Moss, he is now in the risky start category. Do you have a better option? What is that option? Let me know in the comments below. But Zach Moss is going to eventually not be a player that you can start with any sort of confidence. Does that happen this week? Well, we are seeing the trends where JT is getting more and more and more opportunities. Zach Moss still played 50% of the snaps. He still touched the ball 20 times. He didn't turn it into a good fantasy day. And I could see something similar happening here this week versus a tough Saints defense, a defense that only allows the sixth fewest points to fantasy running backs so far. So I think most people have a better start than Zach Moss, but if you're desperate, I can understand why you'd want to. All right, the sixth matchup we are going to look at today is the Patriots at the Dolphins. We get a rematch of this game that we saw in week 2. 47.5 points is the over-under. Miami is favored. This is the largest over-under of the week. So Vegas is telling us this is where the most fantasy points could probably come from. This is also the largest spread of the week. The Miami Dolphins are favored by a lot. So Vegas is telling us the most points will come from this matchup, and the Dolphins are going to score most of those points. So let's start with the Dolphins. Raheem Mostert is still in the must-start category for me. Couldn't overcome a very difficult Eagles defense, but to be fair, there is not a worse defense for your fantasy running back to go up against this year. That defensive line is legit. Keep in mind, in week 2, Raheem Mostert versus these Patriots put up 25 PPR points. I expect him here in week 8 to at least give you 15. And as of right now, Jeff Wilson is really not a factor. Only played 14% of the snaps last week, and he only had 1 touch. That was a target. He didn't even get any opportunities on the ground. So you can start Raheem Mostert with confidence. I'm expecting a bounce back this week, and he's a great play until Achane is back. Now, as for the Patriots, Ramondre Stevenson is the only must-start for me here. After a really tough start to the year, in the last 2 weeks, he has bounced back in a big way. 18 points versus the Raiders and 14.5 points versus the Bills. But more importantly, they are giving him targets in the air. 6 targets in back-to-back games. That's why you start this guy, because of what he can give you through the air as a receiver. As for Ezekiel Elliott, there are worse starts. But again, similar to like Devin Singletary, similar to Dameon Pierce, 90% of people have a better opportunity on their bench than Ezekiel Elliott. He only has 1 game over 10 PPR points this entire year. So again, most people will have a better option on their team. All right, the 7th matchup we're going to look at here is the Jets at the Giants. The over-under on this game is 36.5. The Jets are favored. That is the lowest over-under of the week. 36.5 might be the lowest over-under I've seen this year. We are not expecting many fantasy points from this game, at least Vegas isn't. As for the Jets, Breece Hall is a must-start running back. There is no question this guy needs to get into your lineup. Since the Jets removed restrictions for Breece Hall, he's been a superstar. In that time span, since he was full go, he's averaging 24.5 PPR points per game and 21 total opportunities per game. Dalvin Cook is a non-factor. He's playing less than 20% of the snaps in the last 2 games. He's not efficient. He doesn't look good. You can start Breece with absolute confidence. And the same can be said for the Giants side of the ball. Saquon Barkley, a lot of names here. Saquon Barkley is a must start, averaging 27 total touches per game since coming back from injury. They are working Saquon into the ground, and that is what we want to see for fantasy. We want those beautiful opportunities to keep coming our running backs' way. This is a good matchup for Breece Hall. The Giants give up the 8th most points to fantasy running backs. And as for the Jets, for Saquon, they're kind of middle of the pack, but we know Saquon overcomes any sort of matchup that is ahead of him. All right, the 8th matchup we're going to look at today is the Jaguars at the Steelers. It's a 41.5 point over-under, and the Jags are favored away from home. How about that? The Jags favored away in Pittsburgh against the 4-2 Pittsburgh Steelers. Isn't that crazy? Kind of blows my mind that the Steelers are 4-2. Just me? Let me know. But as for the Jags, Again, very simple here. Similar to that last matchup, you start Travis Etienne and you do not overthink about it. He's the RB3 on the year. He has 2 touchdowns in 3 straight games. You could make an argument that he is really the best thing about this offense this year. Like, he's the most consistent, he's the most electrifying player. He is the superstar on this offense and in fantasy football. You start him with confidence. Tank Bigsby, again, still a non-factor in this offense. As for the Steelers, I'm viewing this backfield as 2 spot starts. A spot start meaning, are you in a tough position? Then this might be your best option. You probably have a better option in smaller leagues and larger leagues. Maybe this is all you've got. As for Jaylen Warren, he scored over 10 PPR points in 4 of 6 games. He got his first touchdown last week versus the Rams. And as for Najee Harris, I'm not really excited about starting him. I know he just had his best ever fantasy week last week. He got into the end zone for the first time. I'm still not in love with the idea of starting him. He's averaged just 8 PPR points per game this year, and he doesn't really look that explosive behind a very average offensive line. So I'm going to say 75% of people have a better starting option than Jaylen Warren or Najee Harris. All right, the 9th matchup we're going to look at here today is the Falcons at the Titans. The over-under for this one is 37, and the Falcons are favored away from home. This feels like a Titans win to me. I know the Falcons are favored, but this just feels like at home, they just trade away their best safety. The Titans just figure out a way to win. I know that sounds crazy, but this is the 2nd lowest over-under of the week. It makes sense because some poor fans in Tennessee are going to have to watch Malik Willis and Desmond Ridder battle it off for 4 quarters. This is potentially going to be a tough one to watch. As for the Falcons, I know Bijan Robinson was miserable last week for fantasy football. However, we know based off reports that he was not feeling well. He had a sickness that he was dealing with, a little bit of head issues as well. But we know that that will not impact him going forward. We know he will step in here in week 8, get over 70% of the snaps, and see at least 15 touches. And if Bijan Robinson gets 15 touches, you're going to want to start that guy. So I know it's a tough defense. I know you're coming off a bad week. Do not overthink this. Bijan Robinson absolutely still remains in the must-start category. And this is not some sort of injury that he sustained that's going to impact him long term. You start him with confidence. I absolutely promise you. As for Tyler Algier, he moves back into the risky start category. Keep in mind, guys, after that week 1 performance where he scored 2 touchdowns, from weeks 2 to 6, he didn't score over 7 points a single game in PPR. And last week, the only reason he had a decent performance is because Bijan Robinson wasn't really playing. So he's still a risky start for me. I would say sit him in 9 out of 10 leagues. As for the Titans side of the ball, this is quite simple. Derrick Henry is still going to be a boom-bust player week in and week out, but you start him. Very few people would have a better option than Derrick Henry. Only 8 or 10-man leagues might have a better option. He's got to be locked into most people's lineups. And as for Tajay Spears, a very fun, a very electrifying player. If the trade rumors are true and Derrick Henry gets traded, Tajay becomes a fun start week in and week out for this team. But as of right now, you can't really trust him on a weekly basis with Derrick Henry in that lineup. All right, the 10th game we're looking at is an NFC East showdown. Eagles at Commanders. The over-under is 45 points, and the Eagles are favored away from home. It makes sense because as a Commanders fan, I can confidently say that we are just not a very good team. We're not a very good team. I know we have 3 wins. We shouldn't have 3 wins. That's just the reality of it. As for the Eagles, DeAndre Swift remains a must start. He's the RB6 on the year. After having just 1 PPR point in week 1, he's been great from week 2 onwards. He has more than earned that role. And as for Kenneth Gainwell, this is not someone that you really should start. He had a touchdown last week and he only had 7.6 PPR points. Do you know how difficult it is to have a touchdown and not get over 10 points? That is a difficult thing to accomplish, and Kenneth Gainwell did that. There's no way he should be in anyone's lineups. As for the Commanders, Brian Robinson is in the spot start category for me. Not an efficient running back this year by any means, but he is their goal line option. If there ever is a pass interference in the end zone, or if they're ever on the goal line, Brian Robinson has a chance to get into the end zone. Remember last time they played in week 4, Brian Robinson scored a touchdown, ended up with 12 points. Now there's a scenario here in which the Eagles are up early and often, and Brian Robinson is not a big factor in this game. That's why he is not a must start for me. You have to play Brian Robinson in good matchups, but in bad matchups, you might have a better option. All right, the 11th matchup we're going to look at here is the Browns at the Seahawks, and this is the start of the afternoon slate. There's a 40.5 point over under, and the Seahawks are favored at home. Let's talk about the Browns side of the ball. First of all, Jerome Ford will not be playing in this game. He has a high ankle sprain, and he's expected to miss at least 1 to 2 weeks. So that means Kareem Hunt moves into the must-start category. Expect Kareem to handle most of the workload. I expect him to get, let's say, 70% of the touches, whereas Pierre Strong will still step in and get some sort of opportunities through the air. But Kareem Hunt is the one to start in this matchup. Seahawks are kind of middle of the pack against running backs. But with this offense, Deshaun Watson coming back, we know things are going to run through Kareem Hunt anytime there's a goal line opportunity. And we just saw this team with PJ Walker put up over 35 points. So Kareem Hunt has got to be in any 12-man lineups, in my opinion. As for the Seahawks side of the ball, this is very, very simple. Ken Walker is your RB7 on the year. You start him with confidence. He played 76% of the snaps in week 6, 80% of the snaps in week 7. The guy is coming off a game where he had 29 total opportunities. There is not a scenario in which Ken Walker is not in your starting lineup, and Charbonnet is just a non-factor right now. There is not a scenario in which Charbonnet takes over this role, barring any sort of injury this year, unfortunately. All right, the 12th matchup we're going to look at is the Ravens at the Cardinals. This is a 44-point over-under, and the Ravens are favored away from home heading into Arizona. Let's talk about this backfield in Baltimore because it is a very tricky situation. I know Gus Edwards just popped off for 21 PPR points, and you probably want to start him in a good matchup versus the Arizona Cardinals. However, he is not a must start for me. He remains a spot start, a guy that you can start, but you should lower expectations. In all other 6 games outside of last week, Gus is averaging 6.8 PPR points. He's not been good for fantasy. He had a 1 catch that went for 80 yards. He'll never have an 80-yard reception again in his entire life. I promise you that. You can come back to this video. You can save it and let me know if I'm wrong. But I would put all the money I own on the bank. In my bank, I would put that all betting he never has a reception like that again. And this is a good matchup, but Justice Hill still played 50% of the snaps. It's very possible that Justice Hill comes out next week and he's the one who scores a touchdown. He's the one who gets some of those opportunities through the air. So this is just not a backfield that I really want to put my chips on. There's a lot of boom bust. There's a lot of inconsistencies. One of these guys could have a good game, but I'm just not really looking to bank on that this week. As for the Cardinals, I'm going to put Amari DiMercato, just like Gus Edwards, in the spot start category. And here's why. Amari DiMercato had 18 total touches last week, and he played 80% of the snaps. He was the definition, in week 7 at least, the definition of a workhorse running back. In that game, he got the vast majority of the early down, third down, 2-minute drill, and short yardage usage. He was their guy. Damian Williams played a little bit of a role, but if you are in a desperate spot, you can start Amari DiMercato. Lower your expectations, expect anywhere from 8 to 12 points. You can start him, but of course, most people would have a better option. All right, the 13th matchup that we're going to look at here today is the Chiefs at the Broncos. There's an over-under of 45.5 points here, and the Chiefs are heavily favored, even though it's not in Kansas City. This is one of 4 matchups that we talked about that is tied for the second most points in an over-under this week. So according to Vegas, this could be a big game for fantasy football. I am in love with Isaiah Pacheco this week for fantasy football. He absolutely should be started in most people's lineups. I would say 95% of people should be starting Isaiah Pacheco this week in fantasy football. The guy has been an absolute workhorse, averaging over 17 total touches per game this year. He's the centerpiece of the run attack. He's getting work in the air. We're seeing less McKinnon. We're seeing less Clyde. And Pacheco, last time he played the Broncos, which was just 2 weeks ago, he had over 15 PPR points, 62 yards on the ground, and he had 22 total opportunities. I could very easily see the Chiefs getting ahead in this game and then relying on Pacheco to kind of close things out. There's not another Chiefs running back that I personally think that you should have any confidence in putting in your fantasy lineups. As for the Broncos, let's go ahead and put Javonte Williams in the must-start category. Now, this is a difficult matchup for Javonte, okay? The Chiefs are 24th in points allowed to the running back position. However, Javonte Williams finally took over this backfield in week 7. We have been waiting so long for the Broncos to just give Javonte the work, and they did that. This is the first game last week, where he had over 50% of the snaps. He had a season high in rushing attempts, total touches, and total yards. So he is someone that should be in your starting lineups based on the opportunities that he is going to see. As for Jaleel McLaughlin, there was kind of a little bit of a water on the fire, if you will, last week. He only played 17% of the snaps. That's his lowest mark since week 2. So it doesn't look like Jaleel has made Samaje Perine irrelevant, which means you cannot consider playing him, in my humble opinion. Last thing I'll say about Pacheco, this is the best matchup for running backs in fantasy football. The number one most points allowed to the running back position is the Denver Broncos in 2023. The 14th matchup that we're going to look at today is the Bengals at the 49ers. 45.5 point over under. Similar to the Chiefs, this is one of 4 matchups that are tied for the second most points this week, according to Vegas. And this is a very, very simple matchup to look at. Joe Mixon, I would say 95% of people, he is their best option on their roster. I know he's not been a fantasy superstar. I'm not saying that he has. He hasn't scored a single week over 20 points. However, he is getting a lot of touches. And we saw Madison and Akers, they were able to run the ball against the 49ers last week. Maybe the Bengals take something away from that game. And we know on the goal lines, in particularly, Joe Mixon is the guy for this Bengals team. So you can start him if he is your best option. I put him in the must-start category. And then you start Christian McCaffrey. We don't really need to waste a single moment talking about how good he is. He's in your lineup without question. All right, we have finally made it to the Sunday night football game. This is the Bears at the Chargers. This is the 4th of those matchups that I talked about that have the second most points in the over-under, 45.5. Now, the Chargers are heavily favored in this matchup. So Vegas is telling us that there's a lot of points in this game, and it's probably coming to the Los Angeles Chargers side. Let's start there. Austin Eckler has been a disappointment so far. No doubt he's been a disappointment. My faith is not wavering in him. He will still be a very key piece of this offense. They'll get him a little bit more involved in the air. He had Kansas City in week 7, which is a tough defense to go up against. And he had Dallas in week 6, which is, again, another tough defense to go up against. Both of those guys are giving up the top 7th fewest points to the position. Now he gets the Chicago Bears, which is a much more easy matchup, to score fantasy points against. They give up the 7th most points to the position. Put Austin Eckler in your lineup and do not overthink it. I promise you, he's my RB3 on the week. As for the Bears, this is a very difficult situation to really navigate, because what I imagine happens this week is a lot of people are going to put Deontay Foreman in their lineups with a ton of confidence. And I'm not suggesting that you sit him. What I'm suggesting is you should drastically lower expectations, specifically this week. Rashawn Johnson is coming back. He will be practicing. He will be healthy for this game. And this organization really likes Rashawn Johnson. Guys, remember, when Rashawn Johnson kind of showed some exciting strides in week 1, from week 2 all the way until Khalil Herbert was injured, Deonta Foreman was completely inactive. Okay, so this team said when Rashawn is healthy and Khalil is healthy, Deontay is not important to our offense whatsoever. Now, he's played well. He could have earned a larger role. However, we know this team really wants to see their rookie, Rashawn Johnson, perform so they can see if he's a piece that they can build around. So Deonta Foreman is a spot start. I would say 75% of people have a better option. The Chargers are a fine matchup. They give up the 11th most points to running backs, but I could very easily see a disappointing game for Deonta Foreman. If he doesn't get to the end zone, I promise you he's not scoring 3 touchdowns again, but if he doesn't get into the end zone this week, maybe you see what he did in week 6 versus the Minnesota Vikings, where he only scored 6.7 PPR points, even though he was very efficient on the ground. So I don't really love the idea of starting Deonta, and I don't really want to start Rashawn Johnson either. Of course, if Deonta is your best option, he is the Bears running back I would want to start. But overall, I don't have a desire to start either of those guys. And you have to keep in mind that the Bears were up for the entire game versus the Raiders. Do you believe that's the same game script that they'll encounter versus the Chargers? I do not. I believe that the Chargers will be up in this game. They'll be the ones putting up points, which means that the Bears will need to not rely on Deonta Foreman that much. So again, proceed with caution at your own risk. And the last matchup we're going to look at today is the Monday Night Football game. That is Raiders at Lions, 44.5 point over under, and the Lions are favored at home. As for the Raiders, this is very simple. You start Josh Jacobs. I know it was a disappointing week last week. Who would have predicted that the Raiders would be down multiple scores to Tyson Bagent, the T-Bag himself, and the Chicago Bears? I don't think anyone had that in their bingo card last week. Josh Jacobs, the good news, still dominating touches, top 3 in usage amongst running back categories. You start that guy with confidence. We know he can put up huge, huge weeks. And as for the Lions, this is very simple. Assuming that David Montgomery doesn't play, you start Jahmyr Gibbs. He had 87% of the snaps last week with no David Montgomery. And he had 21 total opportunities, including 10 targets rather. Now, keep in mind, guys, that if the Lions are up in this game, they might not give Jahmyr Gibbs as many check down opportunities. So it might have to come more through the ground rather than the air. But regardless, without any David Montgomery to take touches away from him, Jahmyr Gibbs has to be in people's starting lineups. That is my opinion. You let me know what you think. But we just went through all 16 matchups, all 32 teams. I can't believe there's no bye weeks this week. So many last week, none this week. Can we just make it a little more simple, NFL? Come on. But do me a favor, guys. Go ahead and drop a like. If you want to support the channel, it's quite simple. Use our promo code LAND. Sign up to the Flock Fantasy website. Not only are you going to support us and help us financially, you're also going to get some incredible perks in return. Rest of season rankings, dynasty rankings, weekly rankings for redraft. You'll get the fantasy hotline if you sign up to the Mother Flocker tier and more. So check that out with the link in the description. Outside of that, good luck this week. Get a win, and we'll see you very, very soon. Now that those idiots are done talking, who needs some rankings?
Hell yeah, I need some rankings.
Then use promo code LAND, L-A-N-D, for 30% off any membership at flockfantasy.com.
Oh.
It's so easy. Even your grandma could scan that QR code right there.